Hi, everyone. It is really exciting to be here with so many esteemed friends and colleagues. We are going to jump right in. Um, these are really unprecedented times, it goes without saying. And, this crisis has really laid bare so many of the painful truths about our deep inequities and patterns of consumption. And so we're really convening this panel to look at these issues and use the tools of future scenario planning to help us navigate the decisions that are confronting us. So we have two of the leading voices in business and philanthropy with us, as well as a renowned futurist to help us remove our cognitive biases and think about how we confront some of these difficult choices given so many uncertainties. So I'm Danielle. I'm the founder of the Tembo Group, which is a social impact advisory firm that's part of the APCO worldwide company. We're excited to be co-hosting this panel with our colleagues from Business for Social Responsibility, which is a nonprofit with more than 250 member companies. Are just a few things on housekeeping before I jump into the introductions. Due to the size of the session, all of the attendees joining will be muted automatically. We definitely want to take your questions as we start to dive into the discussion. So we'll be doing that through the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Unfortunately, you'll only see that if you're at a laptop or a desktop computer. It's not available if you're joining by phone. So, but if you are at a desktop or laptop, use that Q&A function and we'll go through instructions later again. We're also recording the panel, so we will be sending around the discussion, a link to the discussion after this to everybody who RSVP'd. And then really quickly, just a quick run of show. I'm gonna introduce the panelists and then hand over to Jacob to do a presentation about the future scenarios. And then we're gonna dive into discussion for the rest of our time together. So, moving on to really quick introductions of our panelists. Lars Peterson is the former president of IKEA US, where he was for over 30 years, helping the company navigate really dynamic markets around the world, from Sweden to Italy to Japan, and then finally in the US. He was deeply involved in a lot of the company's sustainability and social impact work and spearheaded many of their diversity and inclusion initiatives. And he's also part of APCO's International Advisory Council. And we're really excited to have him joining us today for the conversation. Next, no one in the world probably knows more about big bets and strategic philanthropy than Cecilia Conrad. Cecilia is the CEO of Lever for Change, which is an affiliate of the MacArthur Foundation. Its mission is to unlock philanthropic capital to accelerate solutions to really big challenges. And for those of you who know 100 and Change, it builds off of the success of 100 and Change, which is another initiative that Cecilia oversees and is their competition for $100 million grants. And finally, Jacob Park is joining us from BSR. He is our futurist and leads the Sustainable Futures Lab at BSR. And so I'm going to turn over to Jacob now, who is going to run us through a framework for how we think about the possible scenarios that are emerging from coronavirus. So with that, I'm going to hand off to you, Jacob.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we should be using futurist thinking tools such as scenario planning to help us better navigate this crisis and build back better. And I'm going to share a sample scenario set with you as an example of how we might think about possible futures for this crisis, as well as some considerations for things to keep in mind as we strive to build back better from this. So first of all, I just want to emphasize how uniquely challenging this situation is. We have massive disruption across really every domain, but also incredibly high uncertainty, whether we're talking about the cascading economic impacts of this, the possible policy responses of this, or even key characteristics of the virus itself. We see massive uncertainty around many key dimensions of this situation. And that makes decision-making incredibly difficult. In conditions of high uncertainty, we tend as humans to respond in a way that is characterized by cognitive biases. So these can be things like oversimplifying in the case of complexity, having false confidence in our assumptions, or confirmation bias. So as we get new data, fitting that to our preconceived notions of either how we think things may develop or how we wish things might develop. There's a real risk here that our cognitive biases will create very important blind spots to future possibilities, and we really need to be on guard against letting that happen. As we try to make our way through this, it's going to be very important that we hold uncertainty rather than collapsing it prematurely. And what I mean by that is, for example, there could be the rapid development of effective drug therapies over the next several months. On the other hand, it could be a long time. And rather than assuming that one or the other of those is going to happen and basing our planning around that assumption, we need to actually be able to make plans keeping in mind that both of them are plausible possibilities. And that's difficult to do, but that's what scenarios help with. We also use scenarios to hedge risk in the face of those real uncertainties. We need to be agile in our strategy making and not hold on to our strategies too tightly in the face of rapidly changing conditions. And we need to be able to keep the long-term in sight even as we respond to the immediate crisis. So how can future scenarios help? You are undoubtedly all being bombarded with various models of and forecasts of what the future might hold. As the old saying goes, all models are wrong, some models are useful. You should hold these models quite lightly right now. There's a lot of uncertainty and they are all going to be wrong over time. Scenarios, on the other hand, are not a prediction about what the future will hold. They are a set of hypothetical constructs that describe possible futures rather than predicted futures. This diagram on the bottom left helps you imagine what this means. The outer cone here is the full range of plausible possibilities for what the future could hold. That center cone is the projected future. This is sort of conventional wisdom, and it's dangerous to base your planning and your strategy on that projected future in the case of real uncertainty. Scenarios are a way of kind of expanding our field of view to take in a wider range of possibilities. None of the scenarios about the future are going to come true exactly as written. And in fact, the future will probably contain elements of each of the scenarios, but by considering them as a set, we see more broadly what might happen, and we prevent ourselves from falling into the risk of planning for one projected future that could be quite off. They also allow us just to, again, challenge those cognitive biases that we have in the face of uncertainty. So I've been talking about uncertainty. This is a list of some of the key uncertainties that we need to keep in mind as we think about the future of how this crisis might play out. These include everything from, what is the actual infection rate of the virus? Is there a seasonal dimension to it? How long might an immune response last? To what sort of public health actions will governments take and how coordinated will they be? What are the cascading economic impacts? And a whole range of other things. I would encourage all of you to keep your own list of key uncertainties and to rank them in terms of how important are these uncertainties to your specific organization, and also how sure or unsure do you feel about how these might play out. And this is going to change over time. So for example, we now know a lot more about how governments are responding than we did a month ago. We will know in the near future a lot more about what the infection rate is than we do today. This will change the range of possibilities, and it's important to continually update your own list of uncertainties and your own mental models and scenarios about the future based on new information that will keep coming quite rapidly. So based on some of those key uncertainties from the previous slide, I pulled together a sample scenario framework to help us think about possible futures. I clustered some of the key uncertainties into two axes on this matrix. The first one, the vertical axis, is a question about what is the effectiveness of the public health response going to be. And this depends on not just government action, but also the behavior of the virus itself, as well as how quickly we can bring online drug therapies and a vaccine. And so we could see a range here between, from an effective public health response to an ineffective one. The horizontal axis here is about socioeconomic policies. Will these policies actually address and remedy inequalities, or will they further entrench inequalities that we've seen? Is there a possibility for a strengthened social contract, or will it further fray? Each one of these quadrants describes the sort of boundary conditions for a future scenario. And in the following slides, I'll flesh out a little bit what we could see in each of those scenarios. Just a note about these scenarios, these are sort of generic regional scenarios that were primarily developed with the US in mind, although I say a little bit about what these might mean for global relations in each of them. These scenarios, this scenario framework could be applied in any regional context, but things will play out differently in each of those. In an ideal situation, we could understand how future scenarios in the US and Europe and Asia and other places might interact and come up with truly global scenarios. To do that right now, I would suggest would be an extremely complex endeavor and probably not worth attempting, because there's so much uncertainty in each region that to then further consider how all of them might interact together is very difficult. But I would encourage you to come up with scenarios or use this framework to think about your own region or globally, but just keep in mind that there's a lot of uncertainty and complexity. Scenario 1 describes a world characterized by that effective public health response and more progressive socioeconomic policies. And this one, we see well-coordinated measures to contain the spread of the virus. Stimulus spending actually addresses inequalities rather than just being, sort of a one-time Band-Aid. And over time, the social safety net is actually strengthened and it comes out better. There is a resurgence in cooperation as countries understand that they really need to coordinate together on everything from travel, trade, research, and aid in order to get this crisis under control. For each of these scenarios, I've also just included one signal from current news that suggests tendencies in this direction. In this case, Senator Hawley from Missouri has actually proposed following a Danish-style recovery plan in which the US government would fully cover 80% of workers' wages for the duration of the pandemic, which is an interesting departure from politics as usual. Scenario 2, winners and losers, is one in which we have an effective public health response, but socioeconomic policies do not address systemic inequalities. And so here the response is patchy, but what really saves us here is drug and antibody therapies that come online quickly. However, although these improve outcomes overall, access to these treatments is inequitable. Stimulus spending also benefits large incumbents, but is not sufficient to really help ordinary people. And while the economy rebounds, inequality grows wider and deeper. And in this world, I conjecture that Asia would emerge as a global economic leader as the US and Europe struggle to really fully recover from the crisis. Scenario 3, torn asunder, is one in which neither the public health response nor our socioeconomic policies are fit for purpose. The response is uncoordinated. There is ongoing resurgence of outbreaks in different places as social distancing is relaxed. Some people might be able to get back to work through the use of immunity certificates, certifying that they've had the virus and that they are now immune. But many people would be left to make their own decisions about the risk of re-entering society and would be left to really fend for themselves on an economic level. In this scenario, key sectors like retail, travel, and hospitality would see a very long-term contraction, and the global economy would enter a depression. This is a scenario where polarization is heightened across the board, leading to more conflict and also further fragmenting federal unions like the US and Europe. And then finally, the community safety net scenario imagines a world in which there's an ineffective public health response, but social and economic policies address some of the inequalities. And in this scenario, it's really states, cities, and communities that step up to protect their citizens as the federal response lags. And so this is a scenario where mutual aid programs are being used to keep people afloat, even in the absence of federal aid. And although there's more risk to people across the board, there's also a growth in social solidarity that has other ancillary benefits. Globalization in this world would continue its unwinding, but local economies would grow. And the signal for this one is about Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is actually funding its restaurants to stay in business by making meals for homeless shelters. So that's a sample set of 4 different scenarios about the future. Now a few tips about how you would actually use scenarios in practice. And again, I would encourage you to make your own scenario sets as conditions change. These will have to be revisited, and these should be held lightly, not as the authoritative scenarios for what the future is going to hold. So first of all, you should explore each scenario in turn and think about what risks and opportunities would this scenario present for your organization or your strategy. Those will probably look fairly different across all of them, but there will be some commonalities, and you should look for those commonalities. You should then think about what actions could you take to mitigate the risks and seize those opportunities. The really important part here is thinking about what would make sense to do across most or all of these scenarios. And I'll give you a very, very simple, mundane example. I was supposed to have some meetings in Sweden in early April with a large business and pulling together a lot of people. And it was hard to schedule these meetings. I was coming from New York, and we had originally scheduled them for about 10 a.m. Sweden time. And in early February, I went back to my colleagues over there and I said, why don't we move the meeting time to something more like 3 p.m. Sweden time? Because just in case there is travel disruption, I can still dial in, and this is a hard meeting to schedule, but we can still keep the meeting. It was a very simple, no-cost way to make sure that whichever scenario transpired, we could still keep that meeting, which had been hard to arrange. Similarly, I think all of us are going to want to be, holding meetings and conferences as soon as possible. And it's conceivable that that might be possible later this year, but it could be a long time. And so hedging your bets when it comes to conferences and large meetings is something that is probably significant to all of you, and you should be thinking about. Next, think about whether there are any risks or opportunities in any of these scenarios that, even though they might not occur in every scenario, and even though they might not seem the most likely, if they're plausible, then can you develop a contingency plan for them? So for example, in the torn asunder scenario, we could imagine the disintegration of the EU, and there has already been some real tension between member states struggling with the economic relief plans in the EU. Is the disintegration of the EU likely? Hopefully not, but if you think it's plausible, this would be a good time to start thinking about your contingency plan for that. Finally, how can we shape the best possible futures? This is a set of scenarios about what could happen, and we need to prepare ourselves for these different possibilities, but we shouldn't be limited by these. We should also be thinking about really how do we push not only for the building back better scenario, but beyond that. What are the good elements in any of these that we can amplify? And so a few considerations about that. Number one is just the need for strategic agility and foresight. I can't emphasize enough that you need to hold your mental models lightly right now, and you need to revisit them often. Conditions are changing incredibly quickly. Something that will help with this is foresight practices like scenario planning, but there are other things that you can do as well. I would encourage you all to do ongoing horizon scanning, looking at a wide variety of information sources and really hunting for early signals of possible future change, and then playing out what these could actually mean for you. A good example would be the talk of immunity certificates right now. This may or may not happen. If it does happen, it's going to have quite profound impacts for everything from workforce participation to human rights. And now would be a good time to really game out what the implications of something like immunity certificates would be. Second, how do we accelerate long-term resilience efforts? And I think right now, we need to capitalize on the moment, on the attention on these problems, and using scenarios to help people understand the benefits of some of these long-term efforts that might already be under discussion, but could be accelerated now. One example would be supply chain resilience. There are good reasons to make supply chains simpler, for example, that would help us with climate disruption and geopolitical disruption. And this is a moment to make that case clear and to accelerate those efforts. Finally, the Act Enable Influence framework is one that we use in BSR. This is just a simple reminder that we should be thinking not only about how we can act within our own operations, but what we can enable through collaboration, and also what we can do by influencing policy. And organizations should be thinking about how they push towards that better scenario on all three levels. Final thought is that the best way to predict the future is to create it. Don't be constrained by scenarios or by other people's models and predictions. This is really a moment when we need to think big and be visionary and create the future that we want to see. Thank you very much.
Jacob, thank you. A lot to take in. I'd love to start off the discussion with a couple of questions for Lars and Cecilia. And just before I do that, a quick reminder for those of you that didn't hear at the top, if you're on a desktop or laptop computer, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask a question, please go ahead and just type it in there, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Lars, we all know that business does not love uncertainty, and the picture that Jacob really shared paints a picture of a lot of uncertainty. So, in any scenario, can a business afford to be thinking about social and environmental issues? Is there a business case for investing anymore in sustainability and social impact at this moment?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, of course, it's a very difficult question, but I try to have an idea about the future. Normally, when there is a crisis, the financial crisis is always overshadowing all other crises, like ecological or human rights or things like that. And I think that will happen this time as well, because there is going to be a lot of companies with a lot of difficulties financially. And in the beginning here, I think there are going to be a lot of companies going bankrupt. And of course, there are going to be a lot of people that are losing their jobs. So in that moment, there is going to be hard to think about traditional CSR questions. I also think that the competitive situation will change a lot. In the beginning, there will be a lot of unsold products flooding the market, and maybe prices will go down. But there will also be a big change in demand from people, because I think that people will actually start to think in a different way about their consumption. And there will also long-term, or medium-term rather, be a very big difference in supply, because a lot of the supply chains have changed. So I think that at that moment, with the ones that actually are left, will continue to work even harder with CSR questions. And there is a big difference between this crisis and all other crises, is that now the consumer is in the lead. With the digital revolution and social media, the brands actually are following more the consumer rather than leading. And if you are not behaving well, having a purpose as a company, you will probably be hit even harder in the future by the consumers, if you're not able to show that you actually have a sustainable and a human rights agenda. Investment in a CSR questions.
Thank you, Lars. Cecilia, I introduced you as the master of big bets for obvious reasons.
It was a very intimidating introduction.
Well, I mean, philanthropy is really lauded often as the highest, most risk-taking capital that we have, and we're seeing, a lot of that play out in important ways right now, given the fact that business doesn't like uncertainty, and the fact that there are plausible outcomes that are on that left side of Jacob's scenario chart. Does that place a burden on philanthropy to fill the gaps that might not be filled by the private sector or government?
It does. We have a responsibility, and we really have a responsibility to try and shape that future more towards the positive scenarios and away from some of the negative scenarios. We can do that in two ways. One is trying to inform and encourage the development of progressive social policies and the creation of that community safety net. And the second is supporting, and it is our role as guardians of the social sector that's going to be critical in responding both to the immediate concerns that the pandemic has created, but also critical in the long run, because many of the issues that the pandemic has helped to bring to light and highlight and focused our attention on existed before and are going to exist after. But we need that social sector healthy and in place. And right now they are facing immediate threats of declining resources and increased demand. So we have to act on two fronts. One is thinking long run about shaping that future, and the other is in the rapid response.
And are there any, how are you thinking about the big bets in this context? Are there things that you must be looking at the big bets you can be making?
Yes, it's striking because, when I listened to Jacob, the paralysis really resonated with me. I think I've gone through all of those stages. I think I started with denial, and then I went into confirmation bias, and now, I'm trying to get through the paralysis. And I see that a bit with some of the donors we've been working with for Lever for Change, and even probably somewhat within the larger foundations. Big bets are scary in normal times. And when you have a lot of uncertainty, there is a tendency to want to just hold and wait. But we can't do that. And I'm happy when I look at some of the range of activities that both the MacArthur Foundation is involved in, that other foundations are involved in, or even that our donors who are sponsoring competitions with Lever for Change are involved in. These are all going to remain critical and are important responses in shaping that future post-pandemic. We have somebody who's looking at durable futures for refugees. The shape of that world, given the border closings and given the ways in which this pandemic can have devastating effects in rich refugee camps, it's critically important. It remains critically important that we stay the course and continue to work on that. We have someone working on climate change. As someone has pointed out to me, that climate is a pre-existing condition. When you look at the lungs of people who've grown up in polluted environments, it puts them at greater risk. all of these topics remain important issues, and we have to continue to work on them and look toward the future that is hopefully going to be brighter.
And I guess this is a question really for any of you or all of you. On this point, picking up on the point about climate, you know, there's a lot of coverage now about the fact that we're seeing the largest drop in CO2 emissions ever. But we also know that if history is a test, you know, as soon as there's any semblance of normalcy emerging, we'll see a bounce back to, you know, sort of pre-COVID emissions. What can we be doing now to use this moment as a lever for influence and for changing our own approaches to ensure that this moment kind of matters and that we change the course, that we have this opportunity now? How does business, philanthropy play a role in securing that future? Jacob, I mean, maybe first to you.
Yeah, the climate question is interesting because in some ways a climate-friendly, low-carbon response would align well with what we need right now. And in some ways, those parallels are less clear. So for example, simplifying and shortening our supply chains is something that will hold us in good stead, both during the course of this crisis. It would prepare us for future, you know, geopolitical tensions, but also be more resilient in the face of climate disruption. And it would reduce emissions from shipping, et cetera. So that is sort of, I think, a no-brainer right now, is simplifying products, simplifying supply chains, reshoring, that sort of thing. That being said, you know, abruptly pulling out of production companies will also have real social impacts that need to be considered. And this is already a very big issue in Bangladesh, for example, where clothing manufacturers initially just canceled orders and then realized that they need to make sure that they've got more of a plan to keep those workers going. On the other hand, we have the question of something like the future of cities. Right now, being in a densely packed city is something that would seem to increase risk. And so although that's good from a climate perspective, less good from a pandemic perspective. On the other hand, East Asian nations, you know, like Singapore, have demonstrated that it is possible to navigate this pandemic in a dense city if you have the right sort of epidemiological measures in place to make that happen. We're also seeing some interesting experiments. So for example, you know, various cities have closed down their streets to provide recreational space for people because their parks are packed. People are getting used to cities with fewer cars. Los Angeles recorded some of the cleanest air in the world over the past week. People are starting to think, you know, maybe a shift away from a fossil fuel economy has some other benefits as well. And the air pollution point that I think Cecilia made is very apt too. This pandemic is highly sensitive to you know, local air pollution levels, and hopefully there's a very strong case to be made for the public health benefits of reducing air pollution that would also, of course, address climate.
Lars, how do you think business is going to respond to these pressures and to this moment around the issue of climate?
I think that a couple of things are changing. One is that the one that Jacob talked about, that actually the supply chain will look different. Maybe this is not the end of globalization, but it certainly put a real test to that. And I suppose for safety and security reasons for the future, supply chain is actually, a lot is going to be moved closer to the consumer. Then there is also the consumer, who's actually much more aware of the problems that the environment is put to the test. And the consumer would like to have a completely different idea from companies of how actually to limit the damage to the nature. And I think that is going to drive a big change here in the future.
Well, one question we've been getting a lot from business leaders is just around, obviously there's this new sort of social contract that is emerging between employers and employees, some of which may point to some long-term policy shifts we might see in business. But what about, you know, there's business leaders that are facing the toughest choice, which is to let go of their employees. And how do you, is there a way to do that? You know, this is not the best way of saying, but is there a way to do that correctly? Is there a way to do that where you don't really damage that social contract, but are still mindful and supportive of what your employees need, even in the time of having to let them go?
Yeah, so you need to look at the whole chain of stakeholders, from suppliers to logistics to of course employees. The first thing I think is to make sure that you stay in contact with your employees, because you probably would like to have them afterwards, or at least you would like to stay in contact to inform, be transparent and open about your choices. So the loyalty between your employees and you as a company can stay as good as possible. Secondly, of course, a technical question is that all companies need to make sure that they are getting all the government subsidies and all the unemployment benefits and all those things as good as possible. But the ones who actually manage to keep that contact with employees, making sure that you're not just shredding your supply chain, and making sure that the benefits that actually are on the table from the governments and states actually are coming to the benefit, not just as the company shareholders, but also the company employees. Those are the ones that will take the best step into the future later on.
Very helpful. So I'm going to start to take some questions from the audience. So somebody asked what the role of accountability plays in all of this. So the room for corruption is huge. We've seen kind of price gouging and things of that nature. What can all stakeholders do to ensure that there's accountability in the response and recovery?
I'll take up a little bit of that because this is a concern that the foundation has been working on long term. One of the ways of ensuring accountability is greater transparency, so that people know where funds are flowing and what is coming out as a result of that investment of funds. So for example, the foundation has been working with some grantees who were part of school feeding programs in Nigeria, and where the locus of the feeding is going to have to shift out of the schools as the country shuts down. How do you keep track to make sure that those funds end up going towards the children who are supposed to receive it? So that's one aspect of it, is making sure that there's transparency in the process. The other, and this is a role where the nonprofit sector can potentially intersect with the business sector, is in this area of supply chain. One of the grantees we're working from the first 100 and change has been delivering a set of technologies to care for premature babies that actually have the same technologies have utility in thinking about caring for COVID victims as well. They have a supply chain that they have built up that's secure and accountable. So can you repurpose that? Can you take that supply chain and partner with businesses to use it to deliver the needed supplies?
Very helpful. Do others have thoughts on that question?
I'll add a comment, which is that, I mean, transparency and accountability, I don't think that we always need them. And I don't have a magic bullet to get there, but I would say that corporations should be aware that their responses now are going to be scrutinized for a long time to come. And we're seeing a real range of those responses. And I'm seeing a lot of own goals from corporations that have just, blundered into a really uninspiring response when it wouldn't be that hard to do better. There's an article in the Times out today about signatories to the Business Roundtable Statement on Stakeholder Capitalism that came out recently, and how, what they're doing. And we're seeing a range of responses. And some companies are, taking steps to protect their employees, to keep them safe and employed. But others are really going in the wrong direction. The article describes a major global hotel chain that has, laid off many of its workers at the same time that it's giving its CEO a raise and paying out dividends to its shareholders. On the other hand, we have the example of Four Seasons Hotel in New York that is housing healthcare workers for free. I hope that people will have long memories about what companies do in this crisis, and that companies should really do the right thing, because those memories are going to last.
And we are certainly seeing an unprecedented tracking, right? We're even watching all of from almost the moment this started, media outlets and organizations tracking the sort of saints and sinners. And so if nothing else, there'll be a record of all of that for in perpetuity. Lars, this is a question for you. There's a lot of discussion around changing patterns of consumption, and over the weekend we saw Pope Francis call this an opportune moment to slow down our rate of production and consumption. How can business shape a new normal that addresses these concerns while also fighting for their own survival?
Yeah, I think the Pope is right. I think it's actually gonna trigger a lot of changes in consumption patterns, and I think that what is actually important. I think here is also a connection to philanthropy. That what existential questions will come up much more prominent also when you are thinking about us as consumers, and that's why I think it's so important that the transparency and the communication from companies is done in a way where people feel that, okay, if I'm now going to consume, it's actually going to be from a company that I can trust, a company with a meaningful idea. And I think it's going to be a completely different, you can say, game out there about who is actually the winner and the loser in this, because consumption will change. And of course, if I knew exactly how, I would be really happy. But I'm sure it will change a lot.
And what should companies be doing now to get ready for that shift?
I think it's very important that you are looking at what is the purpose of your company. How can you actually connect your company's long-term strategy to the new consumers out there? How can you make sure that you build in your own values and culture into the purpose of your company? So, and actually the second step of that, how do you communicate that to your consumers? How do you communicate that to your stakeholders? So transparency and communication, but also look at the purpose and the culture of your company.
That's great. And Cecilia, we have a question for you about the whole field of really prize philanthropy. How do you think this will be impacted by the crisis? And do you think how do you balance the nature of prize philanthropy, which is a lot of applicants and just a few winners, with the need to ensure that nonprofits focus on supporting their own communities during this public health crisis?
That really is a great question, because it's one that we are grappling with every day to talk through. As I mentioned, there is this balance to be struck between the need for rapid response and immediate response, and also the need to keep a kind of longer run view. And many of the competitions that we're running are focused on that longer run view. But they have built into them some pieces that I think are critical in this kind of context. One is that they transfer a lot of the decision-making about strategy and about how best to solve a problem to the organizations in the field, and away from the foundation or the sort of structure of the grant maker. And that allows for the organizations to tell us, how do you best respond? We are looking in the next year potentially at competitions that particularly focus on this issue of resilience, where the competition provides a way for many different people to put those ideas forward. So that's one of the benefits. One of the downsides, as alluded to, is that there are many participants, and typically in a competition, there's just a single grant. But one of the things we've done is that we recognize that there is this information gathering function, and then there is a responsibility to share this information to promote what seemed to be the most promising ideas to other funders and to really take advantage of the scale impact of competitions by bringing other donors to the table. We've been successful in doing that in the past with the first 100 and change, and that is the goal with the future work that we're doing. So we're already kind of trying to develop and point donors to the fact that our Bold Solutions Network that we've already launched is a great reservoir of ideas and organizations that stand ready to perhaps pivot slightly, to pop out from what they're normally doing, but who can be very responsive to the pandemic and give a way for donors to rapidly respond if they choose to partner with those organizations.
That's helpful. And I guess the other question, and we were really intentional in bringing together, the perspectives of business and philanthropy here, because we've seen this unprecedented level of response from both communities, as well as an unprecedented level of collaboration between business and philanthropy. And I'm just curious to hear the panelists' reflections on, should that continue? What should that dynamic between business and philanthropy look like as we navigate through the potential scenarios that we're going to see? Any thoughts on that?
Well, earlier you referred to the notion of philanthropy as society's risk capital. And I want to pick up on that theme just a little bit, because I particularly think in the social sector, in the area of social change, philanthropy has a role of making investments in ideas that are experiments in exploring different approaches and ways to more effectively address social challenges, into testing those ideas. And some of those ideas may in turn become adopted within the business sector. Some may be adopted in the policy sector. But I'll just give a recent example. I've been reviewing proposals that are looking at workforce. And in many of them, what they have discovered is that they have developed really effective ways to retain workers and reduce turnover, that's of interest to employers, and that perhaps the future of those is not that there's solely public funding of these initiatives, but that employers adopt it as part of their standard employment policies or practices. That's just one example. I think on the flip side, we're also seeing a growing recognition of interdependency, particularly in the public health crisis. And so there's a kind of public interest in the concept of paid sick leave, where I think there's an opportunity again for some public-private partnership.
I would just like to second that point about paid sick leave. I think right now it's incredibly important for businesses to step up their policy efforts to really push for a stronger social contract that is going to keep more people healthy and working. We all depend on that in ways that are more clear than ever. And rather than simply advocating for or accepting short-term relief packages, it would be much more sensible right now to push for longer-term structural changes like paid sick leave that will serve us today and well into the future. And so I really hope that business will take the long-term perspective on the value of a strengthened social safety net and align their advocacy efforts accordingly to push for that.
Lars, do you think that's happening or that will happen?
Yeah, I think so, actually. And I think it's back to also a little bit more the purpose of the company. Is it just to make money for the shareholders, or is it also that you have another purpose? And I really think that making sure that both from an environmental and from a social standpoint, that your company is actually in the forefront and leading that. It's actually, the old idea is that it costs money. The new ideas here that I think is going to be much more prevailing is that taking care of your employees, making sure that you have maternity leave and paternity leave and health benefits, and making sure that the supply chain is actually not just producing your stuff, but they're actually an integrated partner in your business, and making sure that you're a leader in environmental questions. That is actually an investment for the future in a way that you are actually going to be more of a leader rather than a follower, and making much better business than if you wouldn't. And I think those questions will be much more important moving forward. So I can see that more companies going to invest in these questions.
I'd like to share one other thought, which is sort of related to purpose and social contract, which is that, you know, we typically think of social contract as being arrangements between business and government and society. I'm thinking about a generational social contract. Right now, we have a situation where young people are simultaneously really worried about their future for good reasons, whether it's student loan debt or climate. And they're simultaneously those people who are least at risk from this virus. Is there a scenario where we could empower the younger generation to, with a sense of purpose, really step up and do what needs to get done right now, helping rebuild the economy, helping take care of people, and in return, ensure that their future is going to be a lot better than what they have been justifiably worried about in the recent past. And I haven't heard that much discussion about how to really engage and empower the younger generations, but I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Definitely. And I don't know if do any of the panelists have any thoughts or reflections on Jacob's what he just laid out about younger generations. There was also a comment from one of our attendees that there's research coming out about how millennials are the most confident during this time. So I don't know if how that plays into this, but any thoughts on any of that?
Well, first I'll note that I think there are places where the younger generation has already really kind of stepped up, particularly in the area of climate. And I think we can, it would be great, and this is a place where philanthropy can play a role, to support similar efforts in some of these other domains along strengthening the social contract.
Yeah. So Lars, this question's for you. Given your last comment about balancing kind of social and environmental, what would you prioritize first as companies get back, you know, quote unquote, online post-COVID?
I would definitely prioritize my workforce and making sure that the co-workers that possibly have been had to let go during this crisis, that I'm making sure that I've stayed in contact with them, and I actually making sure that I get an opportunity to start to work together again as fast as possible. Then, of course, if I have a supply chain, if I'm not just in services but also in production, I would like to understand how I can either take the advantage of actually changing my supply chain, or making sure that the one that I already had, that I'm making a new contract and we are continuing like before. Then, of course, I think the consumer, as I said before, will actually tell us whether we are actually environmental friendly or not. It's a huge discussion out there among mostly the young generation, but also many other people, that companies that are not able to meet the standards or actually taking a lead in sustainability will have difficulties. So that I definitely will follow immediately after taking care of my employees.
Thank you. There have been a few hints towards this idea, but could you share how you think business and philanthropy can shape a new future around gender dynamics in the workforce and in the community? This is from a question from Sarah. Cecilia, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, it's with a little bit of hesitation, because I'm thinking quite a bit about this set of issues and the ways in which I think all of us spending a lot more time within the home have an opportunity to, at least on a personal level, reconsider gender roles and division of labor within the household. But I think it also has laid it a little bit bare for the outside world to understand how work from home has an entirely different meaning if your home has always been a place of work and you're now trying to do both of those jobs in the same location. So I think we are going to learn a lot from this process, and there's going to be a need for analysis of what we've learned, collection of data, and then perhaps feeding that in to rethinking how workforce policies are shaped. One of the areas where this has become most evident, at least in the places I've been part of, is the issue of schooling in the fact that we are now relying on schooling to take place within the home, who has the responsibility for that, and how do we support a more even division of labor within the home and recognize the role that schooling can play in the workplace, so that employers might give more flexibility to people to be engaged in schools and communities to help support children.
Thank you. And we have a lot of questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to, but we'll try to follow up with all of you. One last question from the audience. There's been a lot of coverage of the food crisis and farmers that are dumping food while food banks are running short. How are all of you thinking about that issue? Does anybody have thoughts on what a response could look like and how we might kind of change this, this dichotomy that we're seeing? Jacob, I saw you post something on Facebook about this, so you've been thinking a little bit about it. Any thoughts on this?
What's happening with the food chain is exposing the fact that this is really a systemic and not a linear problem that we're dealing with. There are all kinds of price signals going out right now that are going to, incentivize farmers to plant probably too little this coming season, because right now demand has crashed for them, and demand has crashed because their large institutional buyers are all shut down. And that might mean that they plant too little, and then when business rebounds, there's not enough for those buyers. And so I think we're going to see a lot of bumpiness in the food supply chain. And there are, that is a consequence of the fact that we have a highly globalized system, that it is, that there is a, just-in-time element to it. Fortunately, there are inventories on hand at supermarkets and distributors, and that will get us through a few months. But I think, this does make the case for a relocalization and a certain amount of redundancy in critical supply chains like food. We're probably just starting to see that disruption, actually. So I don't have an answer for it, except that, I think we will all see the case being made for the need for greater resilience in critical supply chains, whether it's food or medicine or toilet paper.
Back to toilet paper. It always comes back to that. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Lars and Cecilia, would love if either of you have thoughts on the Sustainable Development Goals, which a lot of people have been asking, what are the implications for the SDGs? Especially a lot of companies have hinged their sustainability strategies to the goals. Do you have thoughts on what the implications are for those frameworks, for the SDGs, for the way that companies and philanthropy have been sort of tracking progress? Is that all going to change? How do we adapt?
Well, maybe I can start. I don't think the underlying questions have not changed so much. I think this is putting a real shaking up the whole world. And I think if anything is going to happen, it's actually going to be more prominent to look at the programs that you already have. And I think that is really important to see and to track that in the future, because of course, governments have a lot of responsibility, but companies also have taken a lot on their shoulders to do a better job here. So I actually predict that it's going to be even more work in this direction, and I don't think it's going to change too much. I think actually the questions that are up in the air are already there, and I think it's going to be deepened.
And Cecilia, maybe to you for the final word.
Well, first I want to second what Lars just said. When I was rereading the Sustainable Development Goals just recently, it struck me how incredibly relevant they remain and important. Take, for example, the focus on clean water and access to clean water and sanitation. When we think about the movement of COVID to places where people lack running water, it is almost cruel to have the advice be wash your hands a lot, just as one example. And that's not just outside of the US. There are many places in the US where people don't have access to clean running water. So I think, if anything, this experience has accentuated that the importance of those sets of issues. Just as it also has laid bare some of the other tensions and fractures that we already have in place. And so I'll take advantage of the last word to talk a bit about the racial inequity we've seen in the impact of COVID, and how much that just points to historic patterns of segregation and discrimination in access to healthcare. Those problems were there before. We now see them more clearly, and let's hope that we remember them once we've gotten on the other side of this curve.
You're here. We are right at 11. I think, you know, my hope, and I think all of our hope, is that exactly what you just said, Cecilia, will be heeded, that this moment in time is a moment where our collective consciousness is focused on the real systemic underlying challenges we have always faced. And, you know, may the scenarios be a tool for all of you as you think about how you navigate this new world and this new opportune moment for us to hopefully continue to drive the change that we're all working really hard to drive every day. So thank you. We will be sending around a link to the recording. If you have any other questions, we'll try to follow up on the questions that have been laid out here. But if there's any follow-up, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. We are so grateful for everyone's time. And I'm talking really quickly because we're over the hour. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, and really excited that we've had such an incredible gathering. So thank you all. Take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.